No one asks LeBron James about his work-life balance. Like, LeBron, are you spending enough time with your kids? LeBron, are you like taking a vacation? Like, no one asks LeBron those questions. And so I think this is the difference, right? You have a lot of people who work in business, but business isn't their life or product isn't their life, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's amazing, right? Those people should not judge people who make business or product their life. Just like, you shouldn't judge those people. I used to judge people who didn't work hard because I was just like, you're put on this planet and you're not digging ditches. How arrogant of you not to dedicate yourself to like building something great because you were given the ability not to, dig ditches and to work in like a comfy office at Google and stuff like that, right? But I think that's just another level of hubris and arrogance. It's like, no, people have their own journeys.
Get ready for the ProducTea with Leah, your fun-sized dose of business, tech, growth, and product chatter. I'm your host, Leah, and it's time to spill the tea. Top of the morning, everybody. Today, I'm hosting a special guest. He has turned 9 months of personal runway into an 8-figure business. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the master of monetization, the crusher of subscription revenue strategies, the retention renegade, the profit himself, the fact dispenser, Patrick Campbell. Patrick, how you doing this morning?
I'm gonna clip that and put that in the front of any video I ever do for the rest of my life. That was great. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the kind words there.
Yeah, it's pretty convincing for ChatGPT, isn't it? No, this was actually fair enough. No, I'm very glad for you to be finally on the ProducTea, the biggest podcast that you've ever recorded something in the last 5 hours.
Nice.
I'm very glad to have you. Can you introduce yourself to the fools that do not know you?
Yeah. So Patrick Campbell, my background's in econometrics and math. I started my career, worked in US intelligence at Google, just as entry-level Intel analyst, entry-level sales operations, basically. And then I founded a company called Profitwell about just over 10 years ago. And we focused on subscription revenue growth, like automatic subscription revenue growth was the big thing that we really thought about. And then a year ago, almost to the date, a year ago, we sold to a company called Paddle, which is in the world of kind of subscription revenue automation as well. And so kind of a good match made in heaven. So that's kind of the lame, quick LinkedIn introduction, basically. But yeah, that's where I'm at.
All right, let me introduce you back to the audience. So what is your relevance in my life? There's a couple of them. So I kind of narrowed it down. Well, first of all, Elena said that you're a really good presenter. That's one thing. The other thing is, if we turn back 3 years, roughly, I was leading the core product at Small PDF. And what we were trying to do is we tried to grow as well relatively hard. And what I remember distinctly is that back then you were more active on LinkedIn. I think it's picking up again. Just some feeling that you're done with Twitter, but we can talk about this. But there was one specific thing, and you were quite insistent on experimenting around pricing often, right? So it was like every 3 or 4 months, you should just change your pricing. Yeah. And so I was in charge of the core product, but not of the growth teams. And I can tell you, in the 3 years, we made a lot of attempts and we never really managed. But this is the thing that actually stuck with me.
Yeah.
I don't know anyone that had better content around monetization and really practical, no bullshit stuff. Not like, oh, maybe you should conceptually rethink pricing. It was always like, no, fucking change it now. Right.
Yeah,
so by the way, it's okay to swear on the podcast. So go for it.
I gotcha. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing was you also had a time where you tried to experiment with morning thoughts of Patrick, where you were just yawning into the camera.
Yeah.
That's what I also remember. That was, I think, pre-exit.
Yeah, that's interesting. A couple of highlights there. Yeah, we did a lot. Our first product was all around pricing. So I'd worked at a small startup or venture-backed startup between leaving Google and starting Profitwell. And it was basically, I was like a product manager and I did a bunch of different projects. And one of them was pricing. And I wasn't really enamored with the culture there. And so I kind of ran into this, I want to start something. I was in my mid-20s, no kids, no mortgage, nothing like that. And, so jumped out mainly because I realized like how important pricing was. And then no one knew anything about it. So you had all these smart people who knew nothing about it. And most importantly, they were scared of it. So you have these really, really smart people. They were scared of it. And I was like, screw it. Let's just jump in. So yeah, that's where the pricing comes from. The first thoughts, that was just, I've created so much content that was like business practical over the years. Let me just try something that has nothing to do with business. So I would wake up and record my first thoughts and throw them on Twitter basically and go from there.
I was very clever branding because every time you were yawning somewhere on screen, I knew, oh yeah, it's another episode from Patrick. You know, like because as you scroll around, you just like see someone yawning on the screen, and you're like, yeah, okay, that's pretty unique. So that's a thing that you get right quite a lot, and I think it's quite funny because even though you're very, very good in very specific topics, you have a very strong personal brand as well. And this is something that I appreciate a lot about you in the sense that you seem to be not too afraid, but I want to also ask you a question about this later on, but you don't seem to be afraid to have an opinion that
Mm,
might piss some other people off, like really to the border of like, no, 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 you're doing this fucking wrong. Right.
yeah.
And then you probably, as soon as you say it, you also feel a little bit bad about it. I don't know, because this is how it is for me, but nobody
Yeah.
knows this. So we're not talking about it.
Oh, of course. Yeah. And I don't know if you want to get into it now, but it very much comes from a place of it's help sells. Like I believe help sells. And I think this is the biggest thing a lot of people mess up is that they either, especially if they're in services or consulting, they try to hoard all of their knowledge
Mm-hmm.
because that's what they sell. Or if they're building a product, it's like, here are all of our features and all this other stuff. And it's like, no, at the end of the day, help sells. But in order to help, you have to find this balance of both being nuanced, that it's something that's more complicated, but also giving people like this very practical, do this, don't do that, or if this happens, do that. And yeah, the feeling bad, I feel bad too when I'm like, no, 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 this is all wrong. But it's also one of those things that's from my like Midwest upbringing that I'm always like, oh, I need to be, nice. But it also is one of those things when you're producing content, that's the thing that gets spread. And when you can be somewhat contrarian or counterintuitive and right, which is really hard. And that's why you have to pick your spots right. You get good kind of virality within SaaS, which is not like Mr. Beast viral, but it's definitely helpful in terms of content, things like that.
Yeah, I had something where I was talking relatively transparent about my, let's say, my consultant life, right? And then one of
Yeah.
the comments that I received, which is usually on Twitter or Reddit, is like, "This is total horseshit. You're lying." I'm just like, and my problem is, I take this to heart, whether people believe it or
Yeah.
not. This is exactly why I'm not on these platforms anymore too much. I cannot deal with it. I'm just like, it's not that I care about that person so much. It's just like I would almost like to just show them either like proof, right? But I'm like, why do I even care so much? And this is the weird thing. And I wanted to ask you about this as well. There must have been some kind of moment where you kind of get exposed quite a lot to people, either your
Mm.
followers, your exit from paddle, or whatever it is, right? But at some point, you become more exposed to people and they start to kind of treat you different. They use the word, I'm
Mm.
honored to have you here, or like, oh my
Mm.
God, I'm having a starstruck moment. And they're not giving you anything to go by with except for like
Mm.
admiration. Was this
Yeah.
awkward for you? Did you get used to this ever?
So in the first comment you made about kind of, I'm going to say, being insecure about the reaction, right? Like
No.
people are like, oh, this is horseshit or you're lying or whatever. I think the thing is that that's a fact of life. And this is where I use something called the most charitable interpretation. And it's something I've worked on for the past 10 years, where it's the basic idea that you can't control someone's reaction. You can only control what you do, or you can only control how you react. And so when that person goes and says, you're lying, this is horse shit, and this took a while and it still affects me deeply. But after a while, I got to the point where I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'm going to assume this person's a smart person and not having any malice. And then I'm going to go, there must be something that I'm missing. And that gives me the distance to either ignore it and just be like, whatever, my day's fine after this, and not like go down a rabbit hole, or to actually engage and go, oh, hey, welcome to any feedback. What do you think I'm lying about? And my favorite part of that is it becomes a game, because then I try to not out crazy that person, but out reasonableness that person. Because all of a sudden they'll respond with something that's typically unreasonable, like, oh, well, you're lying because this, and this. And then I will like very carefully and very rationally like respond to them. And then all of a sudden they get to the point where they're like, oh, I'm sorry, I was kind of overreacting, but I appreciate you following up. And that builds my muscle then, that when someone I actually care about has that reaction, I don't overreact and go crazy to them. So that's something that I used. It still affects me. Like if someone I really, really respect, like says something, and especially if they're reasonable in how they say it and they're not like flying off the handle, like it definitely like hurts me a lot, but that's part of the game. And I just look at that as a muscle. The second thing you said is that was the most frustrating thing, not the most, but one of the most frustrating things about having an exit and having a good level of success here is like, I've been saying these things for a decade. I didn't change what I said after we had an exit, but now all of a sudden I'm like have some credibility because I had this exit. And so it's just kind of like interesting how people work. But, people need that credibility. And I will say, like, yeah, people treat you different. I now have a very large level of wealth. And it's like all of a sudden you have friends who hit you up for money. You have this type of stuff happen. And it just kind of happens. But that's just humans, right? Like humans are just weird that way. And thankfully, thank God I had met my wife before all of this and met my like deepest friends before all this, because if I didn't have that base, then it probably wouldn't have gone well, just given all the change.
This is really fascinating to me because, I mean, I'm not at your exposure level, of course, but like I noticed three things in terms of once you start to blow up a little bit. So one thing is that feedback changes towards you from the market or from people in general, in that I feel like even though you would think that I get 20, 30 times more exposure than I did last year at this time, there is not 30 times more feedback. There's actually a tenth of it. Just people do not give you feedback anymore in presentations, even in the company where I'm at, right? It's just like people just assume you're like, okay, like she knows, right? But like I see everything in a way that I would like to get better also in my presenting when I'm speaking and everything. But like, because people sometimes assume that you reached a specific level, they don't give you feedback anymore. I think I could literally have a banana stuck to my face in the front and nobody would say anything.
Yeah.
That's definitely that. And then the other thing is I'm incredibly insecure with meeting people now at this stage where I'm at right now that do not do what I do. I have almost like an inherent mistrust because those that stuck with me early, it's almost like what you said with your wife. I don't know whether this is, by the way, justified. This is just like me now pouring out my heart, I guess. There's a lot of people who stuck with me when I had no voice. It was the same content. It was exactly the same content. And as you said, right? So then your exposure goes up. And then you get messages like, oh, like we kind of changed our entire product organization based on your article that you wrote like 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm like, whoa, shit.
I wish you would have contacted me before you did that so I could tell you why I was wrong 2 years ago. Yeah, that's exciting.
This is the other thing. You cringe at your own content. I don't know what your time frame is, but mine is about 3 months. If I go back to like 3 months, I'm like, oh my shit, Lord.
I try not to like even look back. What's really interesting though about the feedback is I don't think it's a vanity thing. I don't think it's that actually. I think the issue that I run into with the feedback or the lack of feedback that you mentioned is it's probably not the people that you wanted the feedback from anyways. So I've found I have to be, and this was before exit, I have to be very, very cognizant of who I go and seek feedback from and make sure that I put myself in a group or a person with an expertise that can actually give me that feedback. And sometimes that means you're paying for it because it's just like, hey, I've given tons of talks. I'm, tend to be very, very good at public speaking. It's because I have a speech and debate background. That's why I went to the college I went to, all this other stuff. So I've been doing this for like a couple decades. But the thing is that now I need like very specific feedback. So I'll actually record talks and I'll give them to, someone I pay, like an actual speech coach, in order to get that particular feedback. And I still ask feedback of a certain group of people. Like I know my business partner, Facundo, will never lie to me. He will not be nice about the feedback necessarily. I mean, he thinks he's being nice, but sometimes, he'll just say it in a way that he's Argentinian. He was a principal engineer in her life and he's a CPO. And so he's just very direct, and I think that that's one of those things that like, I know that he will never lie. Like I know he will always like never sugarcoat. Whereas like I have other friends who they're going to try to find the best way to give the feedback. And that's not how I want the feedback, if that makes sense. So I think it's just like seeking those things out.
No. Maybe it's seeking it out, but like sometimes I also don't know what I don't know about the talks and everything because I'm dyslexic. Yeah. I mean, for me, everything has to happen verbally, right? So like for this is also kind of my medium because I'm just suck when it comes to written contracts. You don't want to give like any contracts. There was another thing why you don't want to have me as a CEO ever. I just got to sign off the entire equity stake for, I don't know, $10 or something.
But I think that's the funny thing, right? Like I think creating a culture of feedback depends on, we're talking like more personally than like at a company right now. But I think it's being very intentional about it and then being open to it, right? Because people will blow smoke up your bum all the time, especially if you have a little bit more of a public presence because they want to get closer to you. And it's not a bad thing. It's just they either want some help or they want just because it's fun and they want to be a part of the fun or whatever it is. But, recently what I did, this is something that's interesting, is I actually hired a psychologist or psychiatrist technically. He interviewed the 10 closest people to me, both personally and professionally. And he's putting together, and he did it anonymously with everybody. He put them in an environment where they had to be like super, super truthful. I took a battery of like exams and stuff like that. And then we've had, 6, 7 sessions already. And he's basically walking me through intense feedback right now, in addition to, basically therapy sessions. Right. And I'm not necessarily trying to, clear any like bad stuff. I'm more trying to like figure out what's next and all this other fun stuff. But that's one of those things that, again, you can pay for really good feedback. This is a guy who's like 70 some years old. So he's strict and to the point. Like he doesn't have time to waste in terms of trying to make you feel good about it. He's just like, this is what people say about you. And you're like, oh, okay. And like, he's like, you could accept it, or you could change it. You probably can't change it. So accept it. And it's just an interesting exercise.
That's the kind of operative advice that I actually expected from you. This is pretty good. So someone asked me the other day on like, so Leah, what do you want to buy with money? Like if you had, fuck you money, what are you going to buy? I said, well, I don't know. Maybe an apartment, maybe an indoor pool because I don't like to swim with people because I'm very conscious about my own body.
Me too.
But it's like, like that's kind of like the thing. Okay. But now I don't need anything else. Now I added already 2 things to the list, thanks to you. The first one is to hire a speech coach to go over my speeches. And the other one is a psychiatrist to ask all of my friends. I don't have that many friends, so it's not going to be that expensive for me. But I think overall, this is a fantastic suggestion.
It wasn't that expensive. It's not nothing, but it wasn't as expensive as you might think. But that's the other fun part, right? Like you're talking about feedback, right? Like, well, I am now in this place where this is an obvious thing. Is like, I'm trying to learn a lot about AI, right? Or I'm going to avoid AI for a second. I'm trying to learn a lot about manufacturing, like how to actually manufacture this water bottle. I want to create a line of water bottles. Well, I can like read a bunch of blog posts. I can like talk to a bunch of people about feedback, or I can hire someone who has spent the last 10 years basically putting together how to create water bottles or how to do manufacturing. And I can say, hey, how much is your day rate? They're going to tell me $500 or $1,000 because people don't know their value. And I'm going to go, no, I'll pay you 10 grand for the day. And I want you to prep for it and give me a lowdown in 8 hours about everything I need to know about manufacturing water bottles. And it's 10 grand. 9 years ago when starting a bootstrap company, I wouldn't have spent that money. But today, even if I didn't have an exit, it's just one of those things that it just makes so much more sense to download all that information. And some of that might be feedback specifically on me, depending on, the use case. But I think you can pay for feedback. You can pay for a lot of these things. And too many of us are just like penny wise, pound foolish when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. It's funny that we're doing it in companies, like we pay for consultants a lot of money, but like for ourselves personally, we're very hesitant to do that. But I'm thinking right now, like, I think this is actually a good startup idea.
No,
like, would you pay 5 grand for this?
They do this with Tigas. They do this with all those other products. Those are just 1-hour conversations. But the reason a lot of this doesn't work at a company level is because most consultants are freaking terrible. Like most consultants are absolutely terrible. And we have a services business with our Price Intelligently product. So like we don't like to use the C word, but like we are consultants technically. So, but it's one of those things that a lot of times what ends up happening is people come in, they sell PowerPoint decks, they sell ideas, they sell, concepts like, hey, you should do all of this like thought work. And it's not that the thought work is bad. It's just that, real professionals ship. And so many times it should be focused on shipping rather than all this thinking. And that was a big change for us with our Price Intelligently product is we went from, hey, we did all this research, we did all of the actual, kind of analysis and we told you what to do and then you wouldn't do it. Well, now we changed from these one-time contracts where that would occur to these annual contracts because we were like, well, if we need to help you implement, we'll do it because it's better off for us. It's better off for you instead of like just having the research or the consulting sit on a shelf essentially. So yeah, I think that's why even in businesses, consulting like goes wrong. But in the personal side, you have to kind of set it up so that you can ask the person exactly what you're looking for and then gives them some time to prepare. And most of the time it's non-consultants where you're going to get the best information.
No. Yeah, I agree. And this is very on brand with you. And I'm always like jumping around because I also want to follow the notes that I did. Not for the notes, right? Like I'm okay with the notes I heard. But like there's one question that I always ask everybody on this podcast. And it's usually the one that gives some of the most interesting answers. What do people get wrong about you? I just wanted to sneak this one in.
That's a great question. I think it depends on time frame, but the first thing that comes to mind, like I'm just an incredibly insecure person. I use it a lot as fuel, and I think that that's what makes me functional, I guess is the best way to put it. But it's one of those things that as baked in childhood. Unfortunately, I've worked on a lot of it to minimize it, but still have a lot of insecurities that they no longer guide my decisions, but they will affect my mood sometimes, and kind
Yeah.
of in good and bad ways. I think the other thing is I'm not an extrovert. A little bit more of a trivial one, but not an extrovert, not as social as a lot of people think. Like, I do really well at talks and I do really well at events, but it takes a lot out of me, and it's not my default of what I want to do. I'd rather be in my cave here, basically. And so, yeah, I think those are like two things. There's probably 5 or 6 more that'll pop up as I think about it in the back of my head for the next 10 minutes. But yeah, those are two big
Dude,
ones.
see them in whenever. I think.
Yeah. Oh, I have another one. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
I always interrupt people. That's one of mine. No. So, like, I think this is called social introvertedness. It's kind of like when you seem to be very personable. That's at least what it is for me. And because I looked into this at some point, because I hate big crowds. When I'm in them, I don't like these kind of warm, like, how do you say, housewarming parties, that kind of stuff. I'm the person that comes in and then I go out immediately again. I think I'm also very comfortable on stage, like for an hour or two, I talk about a topic, but then I'm done. But the thing that gives me the most anxiety is the line that forms immediately the moment you go off stage. And then one person after the other wants to talk to you. And I just feel very insecure of like blowing them off, like just saying like, hey, no, I don't have time. It's quite interesting. And I was wondering whether this is ever getting solved. And up until like 2 months ago, I think I had April Dunford on the podcast. And that was super interesting because, I mean, you know her, right? Like she's no bullshit. She's just fantastic. And she's kind of like a role model in this regard because I was also talking to her about imposter syndrome. And she's like, no, I don't give a shit anymore. Like not like a little bit, like an adjusted version of it. No, just like, no, I'm just like in my box, I'm the best. And outside, I don't know, man. I don't know what I'm doing. Just like, okay. It is interesting because what you also said, like, childhood can fuck you up really hard. And I don't know a single person, once you really know them well, that does not have to deal with something. And that's where I actually tie it back to what you said. I kind of just assume that everybody has to deal with something. I cannot see it. So I just give them always the benefit of the doubt. Like with me, you also would not notice at all. Like I'm very, very insecure about a couple of things just because I was mocked all the time as a child, all the time. And yeah, once you become successful, it doesn't change. That's the thing. That was the big learning for me. You can handle it better. Yeah. You can deal with it better, but it still strikes you at all times. That's been the experience for me.
This is why I have this thing called Scoreboard, and I developed this a number of years ago. It wasn't called Scoreboard, but once you start talking publicly about something, it needs a name. So it's called Scoreboard. And so what it is basically a Notion doc. It has 4 categories. It's basically wins. Like these are things that I've noticeably done well in the past, like sold a company for X million dollars, won this national championship, like stuff like that. It has losses. These are things that I basically have tried and I have not succeeded at, but I want to succeed at them. Acceptances, these are things that I've accepted about myself, whether they're personality traits or they're things that I've tried. And like, I'm never going to be an NBA basketball player, like that type of stuff. Things that, I'm done trying if I was trying for it. And then there's like a reaches section, which are like, these are like big things that I'm thinking about that I haven't tried yet, but I might. And they can be as trivial as maybe I want to become a pilot or I want to, cure this disease or something like that. And that really helps me because I look at that about once a month. It doesn't really change that often because you're not putting every single win. But what I found is when I use this with my team, it helps either people who are wired like me, which a lot of people in tech and leadership and stuff like that are wired like us, where they're insecure about something and they use it as fuel. And it helps me look at, oh, I do have wins. Like I have something. I am smart. I have done this thing. And then it also helps people who are a little bit more hubris. They were hugged a little too much as a kid. They have a little too high of self-esteem. No, it's fine. But they're able to look at, the losses. They're able to look at like, hey, I have work to do, even though I have done some winning as well. So yeah, the scoreboard I really like. And I take, especially younger talent that is, kind of all over the place. Like they either are way too hard on themselves or not hard enough on themselves. So I like to take them through that if they want, because I think it's a good development practice. I've had people use it with their partners as well. I think it works really, really well just to kind of hone everything and make it concrete rather than these like bullshit conversations every 6 months when you're feeling down about, the world not doing well.
Do you get the feeling that when you meet people that are in the beginning of their 20s, like, new entrepreneurs, like the typical YC founder that just got his first round secured and everything, I meet a lot of those that are incredibly insecure and incredibly business literate at the same time compared to where I was when I was at the beginning of 20. Just because of how we learn, right? So like, I did not know what a gross margin is when I was at the none of that, right? So like, I was not even close to where they were. And at the same time, they were incredibly insecure. So there seems to be no correlation between the amount of knowledge that you have. That was one of the things that I also learned for me in my life, and how your imposter syndrome kind of grows, because I always had to deal with imposter syndrome. And I've grown a lot in the last 4 to 5 years, but there's no connection. It doesn't get better, because what you do is you replace your demons with bigger demons. That was always my impression. Do you also get this when you talk to younger people that are trying to get maybe also advice from you or whatever it is?
But I think these things are different. Imposter syndrome stems from not having anything on the scoreboard or not accepting the things that are on the scoreboard. So I think for you, like you and the 20-year-old are in very different leagues, right? Like I would say that, you're more like me, where you've had like a good amount of success, but you're just not accepting it. And you're also like, it's okay to see reaches. It's okay to see like, oh, I have bigger demons. I have to go after this bigger thing. As long as you remember in the backdrop that there are things that you have done, right? And I'm speaking from experience, because I didn't do this a couple of years ago. A couple of years ago was the first time I admitted I was smart. And I know that sounds like insane, but like I didn't know I was smart. I was like, oh, and then I looked at the scoreboard, right? I graduated first in my class from college and didn't try that hard. I have a national championship in debate. I've like, I've done it's really quick for me to do XYZ. Like, of course I'm smart. Like, I'm not saying I'm Stephen Hawking or anything, but I'm smart, right? And I think that that's the thing, that once you start to accept it, like, and maybe you haven't accepted it yet. I don't know, you well enough to give that type of advice.
No, so it's an interesting conversation. It's an interesting conversation. Go ahead.
With the 20-year-old, I think the 20-year-old, they're being put into a position where, again, they're probably smart because of what they're doing with YC and such, but they're being put in a situation where they need to have this confidence, and they are being told, and not only actually directly, but indirectly, that they need to have all of this confidence and they need to like exude it in order to will this new thing into existence. But they have no scoreboard, right? Like they have no background in wins, and really they do, but they're not contextualizing him. And that's where the imposter syndrome really, really like seats itself, because all of a sudden they're sitting there and they're like, well, I have to make this work. And this is where, not to throw a hornet's nest into this is where, like, I don't know, Elizabeth Holmes, Billy McFarland, some of these people have committed like really big frauds in our community in the past number of years. Even like Travis Kalanick, like it wasn't a fraud, but it was definitely gray. Some of the stuff he did, like very gray, just to be clear. But it was like one of those things where it's like all of them are being taught about this fake it to the make it. They don't necessarily have the confidence, or maybe they have this over hubris, this insecure hubris to kind of go. And then they make these really poor decisions from an ethical standpoint because they're going, I'm not excusing what they're doing, but it's an interesting thing to talk about in this context.
Let's see where this goes. This might be a weird thing that I have to cut out from the podcast. I don't know. Let's see. So one of the things that I figured women specifically when they're younger are where they have kind of like an imposter syndrome like thing, like you feel inferior to others, like you don't belong somewhere in this group, or like you don't feel like you deserve it. We're always things about our bodies, right? And this is a highly comparable thing. You have magazines, you can objectively, right, like compare how this woman looks. Like back in my days, it was Pamela Anderson and the way that she was formed and everything. So you immediately feel inferior, because what you do is the first thing is you go to the mirror and you look at yourself and you're like, I don't have that. So interestingly, when you told me about the scoreboard, I did something similar, but like inverse. And it's also it was my psychologist that suggested this. So instead of like a scoreboard, it's kind of like a crap board. And the crap board are all the adversities that were in my way, and I'm still here. Do you know what I mean? It's it's not kind of like what I achieved. It's just like, look at all the stuff that was in your way and that you overcame. So it's less about the successes, but like, how the fuck are you still alive in a way? So this is now a bit dark. I get it, but like this is how I kind of
have those things on my wins. I have those things in my wins. Like I have all the dark adversities.
Yeah,
and
you
stuff
were
like
first.
that.
Okay, you win.
No. It's not. This is
Crap
also
board.
my scoreboard is not like the crapboard scoreboard. We didn't come up with these. Like people have done stuff like this, for generations, at least in, the world of psychology and stuff like that. It's just remixing it. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. I think it's really interesting. Humans, we are both simpler and more complicated than we like to give ourselves credit for. And in the world, and the reason I think this is so relevant in the world of entrepreneurship is because our entire business is our minds.
Yep.
If you really think like we interface with our minds online, but we're not digging ditches. We're not shipping stuff in the physical sense. And so, yeah, it just gets super, super interesting.
I think this is quite interesting. So let's see whether I can do a segue that doesn't feel too artificial towards this. So you're very on brand when you're talking about shipping things, right? So like you talk about this a lot. And I think interestingly, how big was Paddle when it was sold?
So Profitwell was about 100, Paddle was about 200. So we combined to be 300. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I left small PDF, we were about 150 people, and we grew from 20 to 150 in 2 years, roughly, right? So like you had a similar-ish trajectory, right? Like with Paddle. There was also like this hyper growth phase where you were really, really fast. And interestingly, there's these two types of leaders that I always kind of try to identify, and I cannot with one group, and I can with the other. And it's this operative advice of like not just talking about shipping stuff, but really being really, really specific. So the stuff that I also told in the introduction about you, like, okay, you know what, you need to do a monetization change every 4 months. I don't even remember whether it's what you said, but you were
3 months.
You were quite, yeah, there you go. Okay. So like, but it was always very, very specific. Why do you think it is so hard for people to kind of do this? Because it's very obvious that it works, right? So like all the stuff that I also write about is very, very specific. It is very, very actionable. It takes a point. It's not just like, oh, like you should maybe consider this or that. It's always like, no, you have to have a collaborative environment. You have to have this. How do you look at this from your perspective? Because I know that it also pisses you off when people are just like talking in the clowns and they never really bring it down to the operational level.
I think it's because in a company, let's just say a moderate to fast growing company, right? Which probably anyone listening, especially if you're venture backed, that's where you are or where you want to be, right? You have so many good ideas and options. You have infinite optionality or seemingly infinite optionality. And the problem is you have really smart people working inside seemingly infinite optionality. And do you expect anyone to like actually ship stuff, right? Because you can think through all of these layers of, well, we shouldn't ship that until this happens. And then we shouldn't ship this thing until that happens. And then in order for this to happen, we need these 3 things to happen. And then all of a sudden you just wait around waiting for PowerPoint decks. And then this doesn't even get into calendars, right? Because then all of a sudden it's like, well, we need Lucy, John, and Sarah in that meeting, but then one of them's on vacation. And then next week they have to do this and all this other stuff. And then all of a sudden you're a year and like, maybe we have a couple of good PowerPoint decks where we're like, we feel like we know where we're going, but then the market's changed, right? So it's just one of those things where I think the operational focus, it's so important is because you have one, what I just described. And the other thing is you have a lot of fear, like a lot of fear. So it's not necessarily like super negative fear, but you have fear in the sense of, well, what happens if I'm wrong? Well, what happens if, I mess this up and then all of a sudden that affects this team and I'm the one holding the blame bag, right? Or like, well, what happened? Like, I don't know. I've never done this before, right? So there's all this fear that kind of underpins things as well. And so getting to a point where you're just like, nope, we are going to ship 1 product launch a quarter. We're going to ship 1 webinar a month. We're going to ship 1 email to our customers and our prospects every single week. All of a sudden you just kind of ground everything and you're like, okay, we are at this current stage of our understanding. We need to get better at it, but we're still going to ship. And then we're going to slowly get better and better. And then we're going to laugh at, the blog posts we wrote 3 months ago or laugh at the product launches we did 6 months ago. But at least in those 6 months, we were shipping, right? At least in those 6 months, we were learning and doing, because most of the learning actually comes from the actual doing as well, which is the irony. So yeah, it's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, you kind of like, it doesn't matter how much you fucking think about stuff. You don't know where it's going anyways. You just need to trust that you will know through the learnings how to operationalize it in the end. Like this over intellectualizing of whatever a result may be in an operational business is not very healthy. So there was this interesting slide that you also shared in Austin at Recur. And very cool slide, actually. I don't know whether you actually posted about it, but I received it from somewhere. And this one slide said that there is 16 times more competitors around. You had 128% increased CAC, the team tenures are decreasing and the wages are going up. In a way, it was just like the markets are turning to shit, or they're becoming better, depending on how you're looking at it. And it kind of goes a little bit into this. Do you also think that so what do you think is going to be the effect of this particular market right now? Because some people say like, yeah, it's exactly where it should be right now. But like, what is the immediate effect for people at the top on how they have to shift beyond just like, oh, you have to become more efficient?
Yeah. So yeah, for context, I shared the market's basically shifting dramatically, and it's shifted. Well, these things happen very slowly and then all at once, right? Like these, like slowly over time. And to give some context, we basically have access to all this data because we have about 40,000 different subscription companies using our metrics software. And so all of a sudden we're able to understand exactly what's happening in the market and how the market's shifting. And what we've seen in the market is, CAC is up, customer acquisition costs up about 130%. Number of competitors you have is like 16x versus 10 years ago. Team tenure is going down because people have more options of where they can work. Salaries are up by about 30% as well. And I think that the thing a lot of people do when they see trends like this, and the reason I point these trends out is because they make like one of 2 or 3 mistakes. The first mistake they make is not putting advice they get and not putting advisement they get in context. So what I always struggled with is there was so much advice in the last 10 years that was being given by people who made all of their money between 2009 and like 2012. And really, to a certain extent, from 2009 to 2021, right? There was all this advice going around, and it was like, that's not the market we live in anymore. Like, it wasn't the market we lived in anymore since 2015, right? And so it's just one of those things you have to really understand. And if it's not overall operations and efficiency advice and these types of things, that's where people like really, really mess up, is because they're taking the wrong advice on channels. Like, I don't know, you probably remember from a growth perspective, we used to talk about you need to be the first one into a market or a growth channel, right? You need to be the first one into TikTok, the first one into Snapchat. And it was like, well, now we don't get a brand new marketing channel once, but every 5 years. Why do I need to be first? Like, I don't even know if it's going to work. I need to like be more effective in my other markets. And the second mistake is what you were getting at is, yeah, you need to be efficient, but you need to be so much more smart, so much smarter about the actual channels and the actual things that you're doing. Like, gone are the days where you can just spend a bunch of money on ads and like really push a market forward, depending on the specific market. I'm sure there's some that exist, but not a lot. Now the days are, hey, we have to pick our spots better. We have to have really good retention. We have to have really good monetization. That's where you should start. Like, I'm not going to start another company unless I understand first, within the first phase, how do I make 10 people love the product, then 100 people, then maybe even 1,000 people before I even think about launching, right? And then the second thing is where's that monetization path going to go? If I don't have a very clear monetization path, I'm not going to spend all this money and time somewhere unless I can figure that out. And some of that stuff is a little bit of a chicken or the egg, but I think this age of like, the age of acquisition is definitely dead. Like, the age of acquisition is definitely dead, but the age of kind of like balanced growth has always been in vogue. Now it's just like very in vogue because, obviously the market we're in is not as great as it once was.
No, I think we're getting forced into it from 2 sides. One of them is that money's just not around anymore, so you need to be efficient, and efficiency is retention in the end. Yeah. And the other thing is that our acquisition game has changed now. It has never been easier to claim anything as perfectly as you can right now with AI. So it's not about one marketing resource becoming more efficient. It's just that, look, you're in an over commoditized market. You cannot differentiate yourself over messaging anymore. All of this will be automated. All of this will be automated. It would be absolutely crazy. And what that means is that the only function that is not affected by this, because I've also seen this, like when I have a couple of really good SDRs in my LinkedIn feed, and they're falling over each other and finding now the best tool to now, optimize their outbound and everything. And these tools are flooding now everywhere. All this does is you make it harder and harder and harder and harder to differentiate yourself, either through sales, like, like individual, the high hitters, or really like crazy marketing messaging. Because machine learning models will automate this stuff to a point where the only differentiator is your actual product, and that's the retention that you get in the end. And retention is fucking hard to get right. And this is the one thing where I'm just saying, like, at the moment, the only function that is untouched is product but not the product managers. I'm talking product for
Yeah.
everyone, right? So like marketing, sales, and product and so forth. So
You know what's funny? I agree with you, but I have a little bit of an asterisk because I
go for
think
it.
that the asterisk is, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, maybe, I'm getting a little harder to say 10 years, but at least for the next 5 to 7 years, let's say, taste is still really going to matter. And when I think about how successful we were both at content as well as with like SDRs and, kind of sales flow, it was because I think we had really, really good taste when it came to what was an email that was going to get opened, read, responded to, et cetera. And we developed that taste over 10 years and data and seeing what works and understanding our customers and all these other things. And the thing with machine learning and AI and however we want to kind of describe it is there's just a lot of like crap going into it, right? Like there's just a lot of crap. Like we had open rates or we had response rates at, I don't know, something like 30 some percent across volume, which is unheard of, right? Like a good is like 8%. And I think that your 8% is fine, but that's going to slowly go down to, 3% potentially over time because of all the noise that's going into the market. And if you have good taste, meaning you understand your customer, you have good retention, you have all the things that you said, I actually think that you can kind of fight against this AI onslaught because it's just taking in a bunch of crap right now. And it's going to be successful. It's just going to lower that lower bound even further. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, you're 100% right. It's going to come down to products because product is so much about taste as well when it comes to creating a really, really good product.
Let me push back on this.
Let's
So
do it.
I think, do you remember banner blindness in the 90s? I don't know. Sorry, I actually don't know how old you are. But
Yeah.
do you remember banner blindness?
I don't know that
was,
phrase, but I think I can assume what you mean by it. Yeah.
Yeah, so English is not my first language, so apologize,
Oh,
right?
you're
So like,
fine.
let me
No,
explain.
no.
So back in the days when online advertising came onto the scene, we had these banner advertisements that have
Yep.
just like banners, and they were very colorful.
Yep.
And then someone figured out if they are animated that they're going to work, right?
Yep,
I remember the first time when I actually started to advertise products there, I had a click rate of about 2 to 3%. Unheard of today, right? So like we have more than 0.02% and so forth. So the thing is, if a specific content has a form that is identifiable, right? So like, I don't know, the shape of it or the size of it or whatever, people start to develop banner blindness because there's a negative reaction to, oh, something is promised, it doesn't happen, now I'm getting rejected. So now there's this behavioral loop. The thing is, let's say you are a really, really good marketer and you can do it doubly as good as the automated algorithms. You're still only pushing a 0.02% click through right now to a 0.04% click rate. I think the problem is, if I'm not doubting you that there is a differentiation factor in there, and I'm not sure whether you and me will see it go away, but I'm just saying, like, overall it will go down because people actually become numb to any of this because there's just so much of it.
But here's the difference, right? So we had the equivalent of banner blindness, let's say, in your inbox. We've had that for a few years, right? I at least personally have had it in my inbox, right? And let's just say that goes up 10x. Well, all of a sudden, the inbox just becomes like terrible, right? Like I just don't even go in my inbox, or it just gets automatically filtered, et cetera. Now, where taste comes into play, and what I was trying to say is not chasing the same necessarily tactic and just doing it better. But I think in the eyes of a marketer who is a fantastic marketer, a fantastic growth person, they're taking a holistic approach and they're getting those response rates up based on seeing where the blindness is and then either breaking the frame of the blindness, which you can do with banners in some cases, or not fighting the banner game and finding a new way in. So to give you an example, we had a bunch of inbox blindness, let's call it, where we had, people not necessarily responding to our emails, right?
Yeah.
So what did like Vidyard do? Vidyard created this thing where they normalized like holding a little like whiteboard and being like, hey, Leah, and then you would be like, oh, that's my name. But it was like a very low production. It didn't look good. Like it was kind of like, a kid recorded this, like, because they're normally like really young SDRs, right? Well, what we did is we did a highly produced video with a very highly produced thumbnail that was like, hey, Leah, and then had your logo on it and a bunch of other things. And all of a sudden, not only were we doing the video, which was having, a much, much higher click-through rate, but we were having these custom videos where it was like, hey, Leah, Patrick here from Profitwell, blah, 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 right? that's going to go away, right? Like all of a sudden there's going to be enough video kind of AI that's going to take that away. But what's the next thing? Well, the next thing is AI is not going to affect atoms as much as it is going to affect electrons, right? So we were already experimenting with, classic play. We would send you a really, really tailored box. It'd have an empty box of AirPods in it. And we would say, hey, we reduce the noise of your churn, blah, 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 blah. If you set up a call, we'll send you the actual AirPods, right? All of a sudden, with our CAC and LTV, that even goes up even further in terms of our effectiveness, right? So I'm not saying like there are certain things that aren't going to go away, but your job as a marketer, because there's so much crap coming into these algorithms, is to bob and weave and find where that ends up being, like, where understanding your customer so much that you can have taste around what's going to work and what's not going to work, so you can run those experiments then and then build those cohorts, particularly of folks coming through the door. So I think it's like, yeah, like some of these specific tactics will definitely go away. Like, absolutely. Like, I'm not arguing that at all.
No.
But like, it's, again, really what I'm trying to say is you have to be good at your fucking job.
Yeah,
like you need to be like, like it used to be, you could just kind of, back to my point about advisors and stuff. It used to be like, great, you have a company that raised $200 million and they're going to go out and buy the market and more people are going to invest more in order to like go buy the market. You didn't have to be a good marketer. You didn't have to be a good growth person. You probably had to still be a great product person, but you didn't have to be a good marketer because you're just shoving the money in and you didn't care about LTV. You didn't care about profits. You didn't care about these things, right? Today, you're going to have to care. And so it's going to be really obvious who's good and who's not. I mean, I don't think it's going to be obvious as it should be, but like, that's the name of the game. You just now have to be good at your job, probably across the board. Everything. Salespeople, you're going to have to be a fantastic salesperson. You're not just going to be the 17th BDR hired and maybe fired in 9 months. Like, it's just not how it's going to work.
It's all retention. It's all retention. In
Exactly.
order to be a good
Retention
salesperson, you have a better retention than the other ones. Okay. Now, oh my God, I have so many things to say about that. So I took 3 notes.
All right.
So the first one is, yes, ironically, by the way, I agree. I think offline marketing is actually having now a new renaissance because of AI and machine learning, exactly because of what you said. I think people grossly underestimate physical mailings because nobody's doing that anymore. Like if they're really, if they're good, or like offline channels just in general, by the way, right? So like that's one thing. The other thing is, I'll give you that you will find other disruptive methods. But if somebody recognizes for some reason that you're doing something that works, the time for you to sit on it before you actually get copied and then it just gets over commoditized is going to be shorter because of machine learning. I think so. I concede a little bit of ground to you. So let's just like, no, like I'm super competitive. But the other thing is about what you said. A lot of the stuff that we are talking about when we talk about product-led growth or like measuring retention, specifically in markets where you have a lot of users, a lot of this means you can measure. And measure means if I can measure, and if I start to measure my team, I'm also kind of starting to measure my own performance. And this is the thing where I have a suspicion that when I'm coming into a company, and this is going to be a very hot take, because I also sometimes advise on sales-led companies that want to do product-led growth. And that usually means they have absolutely no tracking of anything. So let's say you go down market, you expand your size, you start to measure what customer success means, you start to measure how good the teams perform. If they do not perform, I think they're kind of afraid of, looking bad in front of their own superiors, in front of the board, in front of the C-level and so forth. And I think this is quite ironic because it was very liberating for me as a product leader, as a head of product, to just say, like, guys, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing, but we're going to measure so we become better. The only thing that I care about is the trajectory we have, not like whether we succeed in 10, 20%. I failed 70% of all my experiments. And that's not even an over-exaggerated number.
But I think the thing is like the X factor is humans. And I've been talking about pricing for 10 years. We're in this market. Yes, the average number of pricing changes, and I'm not saying I contributed to this solely at all, if at all, but the average time it took someone to change their pricing went from 3 years to, when we look at a younger cohort of companies, now it's like once every 18 to 24 months.
No.
It's still once every 18 to 24 months, right? So yes, mathematically the time has gone down, but also I think there's a human limit to all of this. And I think that unless we get to autonomous agents, which very well might happen, especially with like ad copy and things like that, it should happen, right? But yeah, we're going to do some really creative, like here's a really good example. we crush trade shows and events. Absolutely crush them. Like when we go to SaaStr, SaaS Talk, etc., we are typically never buying the top sponsorship. We are never spending the most money, but we will have the most leads and the most qualified leads. We have a whole strategy. I can get deep into it if you want, but for the sake of time, we start off with growth. How do we get activations, people to the booth? How do we get the email addresses? How do we have good conversations? The way we design who goes, how do they hand people off? Like we have a whole thing. We've done that. We did that 5 different conferences, 5 different SaaStrs, 5 different SaaS Talks, etc. No one copies us. They know that we're winning. They know exactly what's going on. They know that we're getting the most leads. There's some people who compete with us. Our competitors kind of make fun of it. All these other things. They know it's happening. And we're used as the banner and in SaaStr's pitch deck. We're used in the banner in SaaS. Hey, you should do what these guys did, what Profitwell did, etc. No one does it. I think people at the end of the day, there's a laziness factor. There's a fear factor. I just think there's a fear factor too. I don't know exactly what it is. There's an indecision factor. Maybe they're okay with the minimum get from a particular conference. But I just think that people will see novel things. They saw our videos. They saw all this other stuff. And then all of a sudden they realize how much work it takes. Even with AI, it's still going to take work. And then they go, I don't know. And so, the bottom gets eaten out. The bottom definitely gets eaten out when it comes to, kind of these successes. But I don't know. I think the best of the best will get so much better. I think mediocre will stay mediocre and get worse. That's probably the hottest take I can give. Yeah.
We're sorry for mediocre that is listening right now to this podcast.
No one thinks they're mediocre. It's like everyone's
90% is above the average. Exactly, Patrick. That's exactly what it is. I know exactly what you mean. I belong to the top 5%. I don't know. I find this always funny because I always compare myself to 5 years ago when I was an absolutely insufferable asshole. Completely, no, for real. I can do that. I can insult myself. Okay, I have permission from myself.
No, you're good. That's good.
Now I'm good.
We're gonna go through your scoreboard and I can't remember what you called it. Your other
God,
board,
it's a crap board. Okay, so I was absolutely insufferable. Let's say I would have been a competitor to you in some ways in one of these conferences. I could have seen it. I could have looked at it.
Yeah.
But I would not have done anything about it because I probably would have attributed it to some other bullshit just so I have an excuse so I don't have to deal with it. Because that's how usually also people do. They over-intellectualize. Yeah, exactly. I'm with you.
Exactly.
What do you want to say?
The problem.
Go for it. Yeah.
That's the problem. I don't, my competitors do something. I go, oh, interesting. My first reaction is, oh, this sucks because they're my competitor. My second reaction is, why did they do this? My third reaction is, oh, maybe this is why they do it. And maybe I attribute them way too much intelligence to making that decision. But then I go, should we do this? And then I filter. And then I go to first principles and we maybe add it, we maybe don't. I think that's just that's what I'm saying. There's the human element to all this. Sorry, getting fired up.
No. You got it. I think we will lose about 50% of our followers. That's fine. The elite will stay. It's okay.
There's another 50%. Everyone thinks they're elite, so it's fine.
All right. So, okay. I have a lot of people who ask me, how did you do this? And this is I don't know whether you ever cared about content creation in order to get a specific amount of followers or whatever, but I specifically started in August last year at 500 followers. And now I'm at 30,000. So
dang,
quite okay. No, quite okay. It's good. But here's the thing. I'm not lying to you. And by the way, these are good followers, okay? To everybody I'm listening, these are all good followers. This is not just some accidental stuff. This is all product-led growth.
Yeah.
The thing that kills me, I had about a couple dozen conversations with people. I'm not lying. A couple dozen conversations exactly about the same topic, and it was all tactical tips. So let's say you would ask me okay, Patrick, how do you found a startup correctly? And then you give me this huge list of tactical tips, exactly like you did now at, at the conference. See, here's how you do it. Here's how you plan the path. Then you give here's how you track the inbound, and then you do this and that. Mm-hmm. The problem why it doesn't work is because when I explain to people how to produce content on LinkedIn, I can give them all tactical frameworks, all of them. You should not post at this time. I know exactly the conversion rates, whether they work or not at this point. I know how you can maximize your engagements. I know whether you should edit your stuff, whether you should put it in there. I give them all of this. 2 out of the 40 are still posting.
Yep.
And the problem is it's about the consistency because you're tricking yourself that if you know the trick, how it is manufactured, that this is what it is. But that's not what it is. That's exactly not what it is because you don't see how the consistency is happening. For me, it was pushing through my imposter syndrome to put myself out there, even though I will be ridiculed and whatever because I'm honest or whatever. and the consistency. And I wouldn't call it laziness because I don't want to lose more followers, but it's establishing consistency and habit. And that's what it is.
But I think that that's the interesting part, right? So I had the same thing where I used to talk about the right way to do pricing is to do customer development, customer research, and you do it in a certain way. And I used to teach like, hey, here's how you like do a pricing survey. Here's how you do a feature value survey. Here's how you look at the data, et cetera. And again, 15% of people would actually do it. Those 15% of people would consistently see outsized impact.
No.
But then I turned everything to do this. And it wasn't just do this in the sense of, it was do this at a higher level. You said two things there. It wasn't do this, here's when to post, here's the conversion rates, here's this and this. It was do this as stay consistent, right? It was make a change every 3 months. In presentations to startups, normally I go, hey, put a calendar invite, have it kind of come up every 3 months. You're going to snooze it 1 or 2 times, but just have the reminder that you should be doing something about your pricing. And I found that worked, right? And so for you with the LinkedIn thing, I think what happens is you still need to produce the content of like this works and this doesn't work and this type of stuff. But I think it's like the number one thing, just be consistent. Like survival is so much of this. And that's the advice I got, which was like, just post every day on LinkedIn. Because I wasn't posting on LinkedIn for a long time. And now I'm like back and I'm like, just every day. This morning, I was like, oh crap. I woke up, here and I didn't have the time to do this. And I was like, nope, I got to post. Thankfully, I have like a bunch of past content. So it's a little bit easy when I have one of these days where I can just like post something.
No.
But I think it's just one of those things that like, I don't know. I think people want the quick hacks, but then they just don't want to do anything. And so it's like making it as easy as possible for them to like do something. And I don't know. It's frustrating, but that's not your job to make them, right?
I think it's connected again to the imposter syndrome. It's this belief that if you deliver good enough quality, then for some reason the consistency is coming by itself. You cannot, this what you're talking about, right? So like the cadence of something, like, okay, we're doing it every day or like every 3 months or something, but this is an immovable target.
Yeah.
It's non-negotiable. That means if I have a little bit of shit and the time is running out, then I'm going to ship the little bit of shit.
Yeah.
Because that's what I had to do as well on LinkedIn, right? Like I have some very, very embarrassing posts full of spelling mistakes. Now I'm dyslexic. Yeah. It's not really comfortable for me to push anything out that has spelling mistakes, but...
Yeah.
I just told a story where I actually mixed up trust and trout in a board meeting. So now we have now trout in the roadmap. I think that's the one thing. So let me ask you a very provocative question.
Uh-oh.
Because this comes down to hard work and to being relentless. I think that's my personal opinion. Do you think that you have to be in some way broken or have been broken to be a hardworking person?
No, I don't think you need to. Because the thing with like people who are broken is what we haven't talked about, and I don't think we should talk about because it's something that neither of us have, or hopefully don't have.
So let's talk about it.
No. It has something to do. It's like a lot of people are broken, become like drug addicts and alcoholics and all this other stuff, right? I do think that what you'll see is people who are broken, there's a little bit of like I don't want to say like a literal survivorship bias in the sense of like, oh, these folks had to work hard, so they kind of learned to work hard early on. And then there's a bunch of them that just didn't work hard and kind of gave up. But it's a more interesting story. Like the person who was hugged enough as a kid and happens to work hard, it's like not an interesting story, right? So you don't hear about it as much. I don't know where it comes from. I have theories, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. I think it has to come from knowing a why, right? And I think that was the thing that I really struggled with is like, you need to understand your why, and your why can change. And your why, in my opinion, needs to match the level of both effort and the work that you're doing. If your why is to create a generational company, then you need to work your tail off. I don't really care what your background is, but there's a lot of people who are like, I want to create a generational company, and they take Fridays off, they do XYZ, like they're just not working that hard, right? And hard isn't necessarily time, but in the early days, it's time. It is time, right? And so I think that it's a big thing where, if your goals are different, you want just a great, 2-day-a-week consulting thing that covers the cost of living. Yeah. Great. You don't have to work that hard or that much. Now, around that why, to kind of finish a quick framework is like, then you need the people you work with, like directly work with, not your friends, family, et cetera. You need like those people to be aligned to that. You can't be going after, and this was a big problem with Profitwell, is we had a bootstrap company and that attracts a certain type of talent. And that talent is different than talent that wants to go like create a generational company. And so there's that mismatch. So you have to create that team. And then around that, you need friends and family that support that why and kind of support, you in general. And that was a big problem with me in the early days. Like I had a partner as well as a group of kind of co-friends, let's say, that all were very focused on a different lifestyle. And they didn't really support the lifestyle that I wanted. Right. And so I think that's the thing. Where that hard work or where that why comes from, it could be a whole host of things. Like, I don't know if you watch Succession, but like the dad didn't hug you enough, but you're still really, really wealthy. Therefore, you are really driven to do something. I don't know if they work that hard on that show. I don't know. I don't watch enough of it to understand. But like, there's plenty of like kids who've had all the opportunities who end up working hard. So I don't know. Hopefully that answers your question and gives some practicalness.
I find that quite interesting because I would say that what you're talking about, like with drug use and so forth, like this is about obsessive behavior about something, right? And then you get kind of yourself also like into a dependent thing. You posted a tweet and I found it again on April 24th on Twitter. You don't have to check now. I can read it to you as well.
All right. Famous last words here.
This is advice that I would have needed about 5 years ago, for real. You said basically, do not apologize to anyone who tries to question your journey and your destination. Do you want to work 10 hours a week and build a great life? Do it. You want to work as much as humanly possible to try and make a dent in the universe? Do it. It's your life.
Yeah.
And I think
100%.
The one problem that I had is when you have a dream or like a way of life that is just not fitting the bill, the more you kind of stray away from the standard, the harder it is to kind of accept it also for yourself. Because I work, I don't know how many hours. I don't have friends. This is all I do. My podcast, my company, my own consulting business. This is all I do. I have very, very little friends. But I always felt alienated from others because I always felt like, no, you shouldn't do that, right? So like, why don't you go to holidays? Why don't you do this? Because people mean well, right? And then they say like, you have to make sure that you're not burning out. And I'm like, I'm burning out in holidays. I get depressed the moment I do not work anymore, the moment I'm not creative anymore. So this really struck a chord.
No, and I think I think what's interesting is the other thing I tweet every so often in a similar vein is like, no one asks LeBron James about his work-life balance. Like, LeBron, are you spending enough time with your kids? LeBron, are you like taking a vacation? Like, no one asks LeBron those questions. And so I think this is the difference, right? You have a lot of people who work in business, but business isn't their life or product isn't their life, right?
Yeah.
And that's okay. That's amazing, right? Those people should not judge people who make business or product their life. Just like, you shouldn't judge those people. I used to judge people who didn't work hard because I was just like, you're put on this planet and you're not digging ditches. How arrogant of you not to dedicate yourself to like building something great because you were given the ability not to, dig ditches and to work in like a comfy office at Google and stuff like that, right? But I think that's just another level of hubris and arrogance. It's like, no, people have their own journeys, and like the better we are. Now, to your point, I don't know, like I think of all of my friends, besides like a couple of college friends, all of my friends are basically in business, right? I meet them at conferences. Now, crossing that professional friend barrier is always hard to see because it's like, are we just friends because we kind of do business together or we can partner together? Or are we actually like, would you come to my wedding? Would I go to your wedding? Like that type of a thing. So I think that's the thing you kind of have to really think about is it's okay to align your life around that goal. And I think that's great. You just have to accept it, and you have to kind of like know that when people are judging that, like here's a fun story. Here's one that really bothered me. I think you'll really appreciate this. Back when I had that not so great relationship and not so great friends, I remember we went away for a weekend and I was like, fuck, I got to get this done. I got to do email. I got to do this. Like I couldn't go on all the little walks and all the little activities that were planned. And I remember having a long conversation with one of these friends at dinner, and she was giving me a lot of crap for like not being fully present.
No.
And I appreciated what she was saying. But she also started comparing me to this other guy where she was like, well, so-and-so is able to do all these things and he has his own business. And I was like, these are not the same thing. Like he's self-employed as a contractor. I have like, at that time, 6 people relying on me to make sure that like payroll comes in. And I think it's just what I realized after a couple of years of being sour about that was like, they just don't get it. Like, why would I blame them for not getting it? I either explain it to them and they get it and then they appreciate it and can still be friends, or I don't. And like, I just don't need them in my life because they don't get it. And that's fine. Like there's more humans, right? And this goes for family, right? I'm not really close to my parents for a whole host of reasons. One of these is one of them. Before Thanksgiving last year, I didn't talk to my parents in 5 years. And I had a lot of negative feelings about that because I felt this obligation of like, I don't have this relationship. They're fine. If they were like destitute, I would help them. But like, I'm still like, I don't need to hang out with them. They don't understand this.
No.
And they try to, but they can't. And that's okay. And there's a bunch of other baggage from childhood and stuff like that with that. But yeah, I think it's okay. And it's just accepting yourself and evaluating if that's the life you want. And if it's the life you want, screw it. And be open to being able to change your life too. There's people, they have kids and all of a sudden they just change on a dime, and that's okay.
No, I can relate to this more than you think. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So I just wanted to add one thing to this. And the best thing about having people who are doing kind of the same as me, in terms of the consulting and everything, I don't have to explain myself. I just don't have to explain myself on so many levels.
Yeah.
And for me, the story was about when I have to do something on my phone and it is urgent. I'm not going to explain myself. If I'm doing it, then it is urgent and I'm not going to explain it. I just don't, right? So like I've become very unapologetic to many, many people. It's very clear that the people who are doing the same as me, they understand it very, very clearly. That if I'm picking up the phone during a dinner, it doesn't matter how important it is, then something is happening, right? Like they trust my judgment and they know exactly that I also give them the same benefit of the doubt. And that's just what it is.
I will say one thing, and this is a big confusion, and it's not you saying this, but I think for other people hearing this, I think it's like, pacing is still a really important thing, I think that, like, for me, for example, I do have some boundaries, like in terms of, so for example, I started working from home when Paddle bought us. I had never worked remote. I found myself looking at my computer, then going and getting up to go to the bathroom, carrying my phone and looking at it, coming back. So all of a sudden I stopped carrying my phone. I just use the Apple Watch when I'm not in front of my computer, right? Because I found myself being obsessed with like, well, what if the email comes in? What if the email comes in, right? And then, you can burn yourself out. But again, I think that's more of you pace yourself and you figure that out and just, have people around you who understand it, right? So if like you and I were talking 6 months from now and you were like all over the place and all this stuff was going on, I'd be like, hey, Leah, like, are you good? Do you need some time? I don't mean this in like an offensive way. I just mean like, you seem to be like a little frantic right now. And you're like, yeah, everything's crazy. I'm going to find some time, right? Like, and that's what finding those good friends. Cause I do think this is a lonely journey a lot of times when you're trying to make that dent in the universe.
That's
but
exactly what I mean.
Finding the other people who are doing that as well, and then holding on to them, right? I have a group of those folks, and some of those folks have fallen off the list, and that's okay. Like, I don't judge them, but I have a group of folks who are on that list, and when I really need to complain about something, like I go to them. And when I like feel like I'm struggling with something, I go to them and I treat them as a friend group, whether they are friends or not.
Okay, if I look frantic in 6 months and we are going to land on the same podcast, please tell me that I look like shit. I think I appreciate it. I appreciate it when people are just like frank in the face. You're just like, Leia, you look a little bit like shit today. What's up? So
I don't know if I'll go that far. I think my Midwesternness precludes me from saying something that aggressive.
No, you can. I don't.
I don't care.
I gotcha. Like that's fine. It's okay. I'm very used to it. Cool. Patrick, this was a fantastic episode. Definitely went into a different direction than I thought. It was great. Is there anything that people can do for you? Do you want people to contact you? Do you only want to have VC funds in your inbox? Who do you want to be contacted with?
So I'm Paticus on Twitter, Patticus, Patrick Campbell on LinkedIn. I don't really check my LinkedIn messages. So if it's important and not a sales conversation, pc@paticus.com, just my initials at paticus.com is where you can find me. Yeah, and I'm happy to help. I mean, obviously, if you have any questions around SaaS or billing or all that kind of stuff, hit me up at Paddle and we can figure stuff out. But yeah, I'm always up for helping. So it's one of those things that thanks for having me. Thanks for hopefully a good, productive conversation here.
I think it was more than that. I think it was amazing. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for listening to the ProducTea with Leah. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leahtarin.com, which is leahtarin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.